Hi, and welcome back to our study group discussing a history of philosophy without any gaps by Peter Adamson. And I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and today with me, Rogério Marques and Grandpa. Hi guys, welcome back.
It's great to be back.
Always fun.
And today we will be looking at the sixth of our Orthodox schools. When we say Orthodox schools, we are talking, of course, about the philosophy of India, and the Orthodox schools are the ones that are based on the Vedas. And so this one, after Mimamsa, Vedanta, Samkhya, Yoga, and also Nyaya, this one is the sixth. This one is Vaisheshika, and they are famously renowned for being the atomists. And in the previous session, we introduced them and their system of epistemology, their metaphysics, their listing of systems and stuff. And today we will have a more back and forth dialogical session because Peter Adamson really performs well at presenting how different philosophical schools interact with each other. So we will see how the Vaisheshikas underwent and responded to criticism. So let's dive in. Okay, we will be talking about complexity, space and time. So a few opening positions by Kannada, the founder of Vaisheshika, that Peter Adamson shared. So he states that there is a coherence and structure that give rise to something new. That parts, when they come together, they produce wholes, which are indeed more than just the sum of their parts. So they're kind of having here a kind of gestalt way of seeing things. Also, a person is an organized unity of cognition and conception who persists over time. So their metaphysics doesn't just, it's not a purely materialistic metaphysics. They are also concerned with things that even today there is no corresponding atoms or subatomic particles correlating to them as far as we know. Things like mind, soul, and divinity. Also, substances, their properties and universals are not just metaphysical constructs in our minds, they are really part of our reality. So they espouse a metaphysical realism, which is always nice. If one elaborates a metaphysical system, it's always nice to have reality validating it. So kudos for that. Also, there's this concept of avyava, parts that come together to form an avyavin, a whole. And we also have here a parallel with a more recent and more Western thinker called Bertrand Russell, who said, a whole is a new single term, distinct from each of its parts and from all of them. It is one, not many, and is related to the parts, but has a being distinct from theirs. Kannada, Russell, and basically common sense agree on how wholes emerge from parts. However, the Buddhists would beg to differ, and so inter-Buddhists, and they could object to these kinds of positions by saying, objects such as books and chariots, so these objects of everyday experience are mere fabrications of or constructions of our minds, and this is because on one point, on one line of thinking, conceptions of wholes are formed from nothing more than momentary sensory experiences. There is no persisting whole. There is just a stream of fleeting impressions. And on the second line of reasoning, they say, we doubt that there is a single enduring person who is experiencing these impressions one after another. they add, it is our central tenet that there is no enduring self. Moreover, giving up belief in the illusion of the self is a step on the road to liberation. So that's also the par for the course in going the path of the Buddhist. So it seems. Well, the Vaisheshikas could respond something like, if a chariot is not really a whole, but just a bunch of parts, then what is the difference between the chariot and the random grab bag of unrelated things? Say things that I'm just pulling out of my mind randomly now. A tennis racket, a cup, and a portrait of a singer or something like that. So these things are they don't have a definite relationship between them. They just end up inside the bag. They just end up in contact haphazardly without the kind of coordinated and organized and structured relationships that we see in something like a chariot. But the Buddhists seemingly don't give value to this kind of distinction. So they might say, there is no difference between an assortment of random objects and, say, a chariot, to which our Vaisheshikas might reply, nonsense. There is a metaphysical difference between the two cases. The random assortment is not a true whole, whereas the chariot or the chariot driver is a real thing made up of parts. And of course, the back and forth keeps going. So the Buddhists would say, we distinguish the two sorts of case simply as a matter of convention. Human concerns and interests make it more useful to speak of a chariot than a collection consisting of these random items that I just named in the bag. But neither whole is more real than the other. So we might guess, well, the Vaisheshikas will keep on insisting that this is nonsense, equating a whole that has definite relationships that are coordinated and structured with a random assortment of things. So the Vaisheshikas would reply, you are banishing familiar objects and persons from the inventory of reality, like human beings, because human beings are made up of trillions of cells, as we've studied in physical science. So persons, other objects from the inventory of reality, the Buddhists are banishing. And the Vaisheshikas would go on, whereas our position is clearly backed by everyday experience and common sense. The burden of proof clearly rests with you. And so the Buddhists would go, at least some of the objects of everyday experience actually are mere sums of parts. A forest is nothing more than a bunch of trees. An army is just a bunch of soldiers, and films are just sequences of frames producing, in our minds, the illusion of continuity. Clearly, some apparently real wholes are nothing more than assemblages of parts, whose unity is a matter of illusion or convention. So, don't we have a good reason to suspect that this may be true in other cases as well? It seems extravagant to assume that there are ever real wholes, when we know that a mere collection of parts can generate a convincing yet false impression that there is such a whole. Why not think that a random assortment of objects, rather, why not think that a being like a human being or a chariot, something that is made of parts that fit together and has a purpose and a function, is just an illusion created by the conjunction of as you say, the atoms. And so the Buddhists here might be tempted to pick on the Vaisheshikas for being atomists, and so the atoms as being indivisible elements of the physical universe are actually the excellence, the ex libris of parts that compose what the Vaisheshikas are calling wholes. So then the Vaisheshikas might reply, individual atoms are too small to be perceived. We cannot see them at all. The things we see made of atoms are real things over and above the atoms. If the only real thing present were the atoms, there would be nothing for us to perceive. So, and then the Vaisheshikas might add, a whole inheres in its parts, or we might more loosely say that it resides or occurs in them, which will give some fuel for the Buddhists to reply. Does the entire whole occur in each of its parts? That seems impossible. If the whole resides in one part, it cannot reside in another, since it would be in two different places at the same time. So the whole must reside only partly in each part. So how can the whole be a unity at all? So for instance, a book, we could say, oh, the book has 60 pages and it resides in the pages. And then the Buddhists would say, oh, the entire book resides in the page. So that doesn't make any sense at all. How can it reside in different pages at the same time, the entire book? Well, that's using language to make things seem plausible when maybe they're not. So then the Vaisheshikas could say, we will clarify our conception of part-whole relationship, especially explaining what we mean by inherence. When a universal inheres in its particulars, we are convinced that the universal nature of particulars is a real thing. However, the reality of the universal depends on there being actual particulars. If all crocodiles or, say, giraffes go extinct, there would no longer be a universal. So the universal is inseparable from its instances. This is in contrast with the Platonists, who thought that the transcendent forms were eternal and independent of the instances in which they might reside. So the Vaisheshikas were a bit more close to Aristotelians, in which they say that universals are immanent in the particulars. Then the Vaisheshikas could say, the chariot is more than just the axle, wheels, and carriage, but could not exist if these parts did not exist. So there is this concept of Samayavin. I will share it here. So, I'm sharing as if I were Nerdalliun. So Samavayan, a special kind of cause, so which is the parts that make up a whole. And this might make us think of Aristotle's material cause. It's only in part similar to Aristotle's material cause, because Samavayan might even be non-material entities like minds or thoughts or something like that. So Samavayan, a special kind of cause, which is the parts that make up a whole. So the Vaisheshikas say, we assume that universals are eternal and uncreated, though they depend on particular instances to exist. So maybe they mean to exist in our perceivable reality. A whole, by contrast, cannot survive without its particular parts surviving. Despite their difference, both universals and wholes have a relation of inherence to their particulars and their parts, respectively. Instances are causes of the universal. Parts are causes of the whole. So this is really summarizes quite interestingly this thing of complexity arising from particulars and including the relationships between instances and their universal and parts in their whole. I'm not sure if you're hearing, but my dog has went berserk or something like that. Sorry about that. He's very, very nervous. Then, well, there is since Vaisheshikas are in part very, very concerned with material stuff, the material part of the universe. They have some cosmological speculations. So this is one of the authors, Bimal Matilal, who says philosophical activity in India arose out of the cosmogonic speculations of the Vedas and the Upanishads. The all-important business of philosophy was to attempt to discover some simple unitary cause of the origin of this complex universe. And of course, Panini's system of Caracas was foundational as well for the Vaisheshikas due to its emphasis on action. So the center of the grammar is verbs which represent events or processes, while the nouns are basically just the contributors in some form, as an agent, as an instrument, other things that contribute to the event or the process. And this is really, really very important for us to remind ourselves that when they talk about pramana or prama, so things that are related to knowledge, they are not static entities. Pramana are processes that cause awareness, while awareness is an event of awareness. So it's again an event, something active, something that happens. Sorry for the typo there. Event of awareness. So the verb and noun relate to each other based on an underlying causal model. Then Adamson mentioned the three widely used stock examples of Indian philosophy that, again, are used also in the Vaisheshika system. We've heard of them before when we talked about Nyaya, and since the elephant was in the room, Adamson admitted that these really they really don't use any other examples practically for these things. So they use the idea of the ceramic pot, where the causes are the potter, the potter's wheel, the potter's stick, the two halves of the pot that come together to finalize the pot, while the cloth is made of threads. Its causes are threads from which it is woven, the weaver, shuttle, loom, various instances of contact, like contact between interwoven threads. So they're also hinting at that matter interacts with each other, something that people from physics and chemistry are completely aware of. Van der Waals interactions, covalent bonds, etc., etc. These things are there; they actually exist, as described by contemporary material natural philosophy, aka science. Also, the chopping down of a tree, it causes the axe, contact of the axe with the tree, axe wielder, etc. So they don't just have a metaphysics that describes stuff. It also describes the interactions, the contact between stuff, and also the actions, especially the actions as well. So in all these examples, parts are included as the causes, but in the first two examples, we have parts coming together and also the agents of creation, the potter and the weaver, and they create an object. While in the third example, we're talking about the product being an actual event, the tree being felled. So it's different. And then there are these types of causes. So there is samavaya karana, so a substrate or inherence cause. Asamavaya karana, a non-substrate or non-inherence cause. And then there is nimitta karana, an instrumental cause. So for the samavaya karana, substrate or inherence cause, it refers to an object's parts, and unlike Aristotle's material causes I mentioned previously, it can also be immaterial substances. Also, the parts are not necessarily identical with the material from what it is made, as in the example of felling a tree. Even though the parts are the X, the outcome is nothing like the parts that came together for the event to happen. Then there is non-substrate or non-inherence causes and instrumental causes. Okay, I didn't understand very well these other two, but in discussion, if you guys have figured out anything, please feel free to share. That's all. I think it's a good time to pause here and discuss a bit before moving forward more. So tagging out.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to discuss. I'm not so sure about the exact explanation of each of these different causes. I do remember Peterson talking about the fact that universals inhere in their particulars slightly in a different way than wholes inhere in their parts. I think you either talk a little bit about that, but so the particulars would be a substrate of a universal, and I think the parts would be a substrate of a whole. So I guess non-substrate causes and or instrumental causes would just be anything that makes a thing exist or happen that aren't part of that thing or isn't an instance of that thing. So when we think of the pot, the clay that eventually comes together, or the two halves of the pot, are all inherent causes of the pot, whereas the potter who's doing wouldn't be an inherent cause, and maybe some of the instruments the potter uses to make the pot would be instrumental causes, if I had to take a guess.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. Maybe it's exactly like that.
That would be my best guess anyways.
Yeah.
Then I wanted to comment on a couple of slides earlier. You talked about the Buddhists sort of denying the existence of wholes, and there was the exchange about random collections of things, and the Buddhist response being that there's no real difference between say a chariot and a random collection of objects. The only reason we talk about chariots are purely by convention, and those conventions are established by or depend on human purposes and desires, so human utility. And there's a pragmatist in me that kind of wants to say that, yeah, well, all of metaphysics more or less bows to specific purposes at the end of the day. Like, we're doing metaphysics for a reason, so when we say something exists or doesn't exist, we have there are purposes in the background, and it's useful to consider some things to exist, and sometimes not so useful to consider other things to exist. So it can be, well, we've had this discussion like many times, so I'm just sort of reminded of some stuff we said in the past where sometimes, depending on what your use is, you want to think of the particles and the forces holding the particles together that make up the giraffe, and other times, depending on what you're trying to do, you want to think of sort of the cells and the molecules that make up the giraffe. Other times you want to think of the organ systems the organs and the organ systems, and other times you just want to think of giraffes, and at other times you want to think of sort of troops of giraffes or a herd of giraffes at that level. And sometimes you want to think of sort of more giraffes is just a generic example of animals, and you want to kind of think of animals. And yeah, so like depending on your purposes at hand, you'd have different uses for different of those concepts. And I think so. The bit about convention is correct, but I think that there's something wrong about just saying there's no other difference between the random collection and the chariot than just convention. I mean, there are several differences between a random collection and something like a chariot that are relevant to human goals and purposes. And so chariots have these properties that a random collection doesn't have in a way that's useful to people that makes it useful to people to talk about chariots. So chariots can do things that a random collection can't do because of their organization, and so because those things that a chariot can do that a random collection can't do are useful to people, like people want to talk about chariots. So it's not just that there's this convention about chariots, there is actually properties of chariots as a organized collection rather than a random collection that make them useful. So there's at least those two levels at which there are difference. They're not just existentially exactly alike, except for the fact that humans have given a name to one. Like that they're different in many kinds of ways. And then the other comment I wanted to make was about the examples of everyday things that the Buddhists proposed, or at least Peter Adamson puts in the mouths of the Buddhists, propose as examples of wholes that really are just illusory. So the examples of a forest, an army, and a movie. I'm guessing Buddhists never talk about the...
Yeah. Adamson surely added that one.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure about the forest and army. They had forests and they had armies, so they might have talked about those. And I kind of want to say, like, forests have properties that, like, a random collection of plants don't. So if you just had to pick plants at random, sort of all over the world, and just have a collection of random plants, like, that wouldn't have the same properties as an ecosystem of forest thriving.
Yeah.
So I do think a forest is legitimately...
The trees in a forest for sure communicate with each other. We know that through the root systems and mycorrhiza, the fungal growth, whatever it's called. It's the relationships are there.
Yeah. So forests have properties over and beyond just a random collection of plants, and definitely properties over and beyond a random collection of just things. Like if you made a random collection of things, it would have different properties than a forest. So I think sort of by the same thing as chariots, like I do think forests are a whole thing. And also I'm not so sure that people perceive forests as wholes. Like I think people are much more likely to perceive parts of a forest, or maybe even perceive individual trees and individual elements, than to perceive a whole forest. Forests are a little bit big for humans to have a perception of the whole thing. Now that people can fly, you can sort of, from an aerial view, perceive a forest. Maybe if you were high on a mountain, you could look down on a forest. You might have perceived a forest as a thing back in their time. But if you're walking in a forest, you wouldn't be perceiving it as one thing, I don't think. Maybe as one place, but same thing with an army. Like it's kind of difficult to maybe the example of armies I have in my mind are different than armies. Maybe they're thinking sort of like a battalion, like 1,000 soldiers. You can imagine them sort of organized on a battlefield, and you could look at them and maybe have an experience of a whole that's illusory. But modern armies are not just one battalion you could put in one place and have a look. Like there's the army, like the United States Army is kind of spread all over the world in different kinds of things, ships and planes and command centers and like barracks and people and the bases and forward operating bases, like just a bunch of stuff all over the place that it would be very difficult to perceive as a whole. So I think a forest and army are maybe not great examples of things we have a very strong illusion as being one whole thing. Like I think we probably would be perceiving parts of forests or parts of armies and struggle to get a picture of the whole thing. And then, yeah, when it comes to movies, putting the frames in the specific order that they're put, it gives the movie properties that it wouldn't have if those same frames were jumbled in a random order. And they're not just frames, they're also sound files, and so encodings or vibrations. But yeah, if you would just scramble the data a movie is made up of into a random bunch of noise, like the random bunch of noise would have very different properties than the movie. And so since the specific organization of the parts have properties that random organizations or random parts wouldn't have, I think it is useful to make the convention of calling those things by name. So I'm kind of siding with the Buddhists and I'm kind of siding with the Vaisheshikas. So the Vaisheshikas says, no, there is, like, what we're doing is we're figuring out words to describe reality that's there without the words, and that's all we're doing. So we're trying to match our words with the things that exist in reality, where the Buddhists are saying something more like, no, we're establishing conventions for talking about reality. And I don't know, just to my way of thinking, that establishing conventions for talking about reality comes more naturally. But then I think those conventions are only useful or not useful because there is a reality that we're talking about. And we could talk about it in different ways and still get uses out of it. So I'm not so drawn to the idea that we're going to ever discover the final best correct way to talk about reality. But I do think there is a reality that we're talking about, and like the reason it's useful to talk about forests and armies and movies and chariots for that matter, and not have specific names for just random collections of things, is because those things we have names for have properties that make them relevant to our purposes. So we have we're, first of all, like the Buddhists say, we're not really people. We don't have selves. We are real people with selves, and we have goals and stuff. And the Buddhists say, well, we only have goals because we're ignorant, and if we were enlightened, we wouldn't have goals, which I also don't agree with. So yeah, I think we're real people and we have goals, and that's all right and good and proper. And like because we have goals, we want to achieve them, and part of how we do that is we talk to other people about how to achieve those goals. And some ways of talking more useful than others, and like calling a chariot rather than, hey, that random mix of spokes and like horses and charioteers, not all that useful. And last thing, then I'll tag out. I think the Buddhists are at risk of going down a regress. So if the chariot is nothing but a collection of parts, why aren't the parts just collections of parts that don't exist? Like the wheel may just be spokes and a round thing and a hubcap, and maybe the spokes are just like fibers of wood, and maybe the fibers of wood, like maybe there's nothing there at all. So maybe they'd be reduced to saying it's all just illusory if they want to say like none of the holes are ever real. Like where do they get any parts from? Like even their skandhas, you might say like, well, why? Like how? Like the collection of what? Wouldn't it be a collection of holes, like individual things? Maybe let's say it would just be elementary individual things that are themselves not made up of anything. That would make them atomists, essentially, in agreement with the Vaisheshikas.
Maybe having a sigh of relief for the atomism being the case, so that they don't have an infinite regress.
Yeah. I don't actually know what their position on that is because I don't know all that much about Buddhism. I've got a feeling I'm going to learn more about Buddhism than I've ever wanted to know soon enough. But yeah, I don't know how to answer it.
And here I thought you had already passed that point of knowing more about Buddhism than you wanted to know.
I've known more Buddhists than I could. Like the specific Buddhists I've known, I wish I hadn't.
Now, I think the other option there is that the Buddhists would say, yeah, there's an infinite regress, but none of it's real. So it's an infinite regress of nothing. So what's the problem? As long as it's, it's like, and again, it's basically the traditional Buddhist challenge. They're sitting there at the table with the sign saying, I'm not real, prove me wrong.
But then they say, well, the individual selves are not real and a whole bunch of stuff is not real, but then they also go into a lot of detail saying how the Buddha was a self that was reborn something like 8,000 times or something like that, that actually his soul got better and better and more enlightened and stuff, so that in his last life he was all set for either a life of bloodthirsty conquest if he was stayed as a king or whatnot, or as a so-called spiritual teacher, because his soul was already so enlightened and whatnot. So how can you go into all that kind of setup for your system of religion or philosophy, and then say that there is no self? So when I listen to Buddhists like Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, who I really do recommend to listen to. He really does sound like a philosopher, not like a proselytizer. He really doesn't care if you really do believe in a form of theism or not. And he really insists that you check things for yourself and be self-critical and skeptical. But in moderation, of course, to not have your mind closed as to not be able to grasp new ideas, but also to not have your mind so closed that your brain's full of. So a really interesting position by this Buddhadasa Bhikkhu teacher he was from somewhere from the Southeast Asia, and he taught in the 20th century or something like that. I think he was from Thailand. So yeah, I afterward I can share with you guys the YouTube playlist on this Buddhadasa Bhikkhu figure, that I think he represents the Buddhist doctrine without all the add-ons that were being grafted on by Mahayana tradition, so that they could just expand their numbers, their followership. No, he is a much more focused on what matters kind of guy, which is really interesting for this very, very complex and heterogeneous tradition of Buddhism. Inside such a big thing, to find people that are actually saying things that are coherent and consistent and make sense, instead of just meandering around with language, trying to prove others wrong and stuff like that. That's might be interesting, so that people like the Vaisheshikans will go the extra mile to refine their metaphysical systems as much as can be, because of the being under fire of criticism, which is a very, very common pattern in philosophy. When philosophy blossoms, there is often this kind of back and forth of criticism. It also happened in the Greco-Roman world with the Hellenistic traditions. And well, that's pretty much what I had to say, tagging out. Feel free to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of more points, and that is some of their ideas. They seem very much that they're wrestling with like a primitive version of set theory. And it's echoing a lot of Bertrand Russell between, sets not always being able to be parts of themselves. And that seems to be a lot what they're wrestling with the whole and the parts, and with that they're trying to do with the properties and substances, and the emphasis on like the forest, where the sustainability, self-sustainability of something over time is part of it. And that's one of the what I would rebut the Buddhists with, is via set theory, where you can have a random selection of elements, but you can also have an underlying rule like all even numbers. And that's the difference between a chariot, which has an underlying rule, and just a random assortment of parts. And to me, that's where the focus is, as to whether it has that underlying rule, that underlying unity. And if it does, then it's basically organization is a separate level unto itself, and it's separate from the part level, because you can have the same parts, and depending on how they're organized, they either function or they don't as an engine, so to speak. And that's sort of where I'm coming at from it. Gonna tag out.
I would also like to say that metaphysics is really useful to discuss things that we cannot perceive, but of which the effects and consequences we are subject. For instance, people have personalities, they have behavior that comes from whatever happens in their minds that we cannot perceive directly. People come together as families, as corporations, businesses, etc., as armies even. And if the school, suppose we the three have a school of philosophy, and we want to convince people that we have a grasp on reality. If we look at a random bunch of people that just came together because they are mates in kind of like flatmates, because they are just studying, or some of them are working and whatnot, and the only thing binding them together is the fact that they live in the same apartment, but they don't talk that much. They have nothing in common pretty much in terms socially. While if you compare these people with a family, that they dine together every single day, that they have these rituals, they have conversations, etc., these day-to-day things. I think it would be quite inconsistent for a metaphysical system to claim that these two groups of people have equal qualities of relationships between them. And to me, it seems that the Buddhists are coming a bit like that. For one, they are stressing the importance of flows of chains of consequence, of causes and consequences, because of their metaphysics focusing on flow of changes, of interconnectedness, of codependent generation and whatnot. And everything is in flow, everything is interconnected. And while they're saying that everything is interconnected, they're just diluting the importance of interconnectedness to an extent that they either don't care if an army is a crappy army because the units don't interact within them, they don't coordinate and communicate, or if it's a really good army because they are very well coordinated, they are all obeying to a consistent doctrine of war, and their commanders are coordinating operations really effectively with the individual soldiers and whatnot. So I think that they really don't care. They really don't want to be able to qualify these different examples that I gave.
Yeah, I don't know how much. I don't actually know how the debate really went and how much Peter Adamson is inventing. And is it Jonardon or Jonardon Ganeri?
Jonardon, yeah.
Jonardon. So how much they're inventing a bit of a dialectic for pedagogical reasons, and like how much the Buddhists actually did enter into, like, Buddhist thinkers entered into explicit debate with Vaisheshika thinkers. Part of me thinks the early Buddhists were mostly centered around Sri Lanka, weren't they? And that would be a bit far away from the main action of the Vaisheshikas, I think. But anyway, so I don't know how much of this debate actually went down, because I think they might have taken a similar tactic to undermine some of their own positions, which is, I think, similar to what you're saying, what you said earlier about their talk about the Buddha and his reincarnation and whatever. And that's a common criticism of the Buddhists. If selves don't persist, then if there are no selves that persist over time, how can you reincarnate? Like, if you're not even the same person you were yesterday, how can you be the same person in a next life? And if you're not the same person in the next life, then what's the point of trying to stop it reincarnating? Like
Yeah.
it's other people's problems. Like you could just, why are you bothered by it? But yeah, so I think maybe in this debate, there's a bit of trying to deny the validity of other metaphysical systems as just part of the game, kind of philosophers and spiritual schools were playing then. Peter Adamson has said a couple of times stuff along the lines like, in India it was never good enough to prove yourself right, you also had to prove your adversaries wrong.
Yeah.
So there may be a bit of that, and like it may be that the Vaisheshikas were slightly straw manning the Buddhists in order to play this game. So not good enough to say, here's our metaphysical system, but then also say like, this is how we're better than the other schools. And then everybody's favorite black sheep to pick on was apparently the Buddhists. The Jainas getting off lightly of criticism. I would have thought maybe it's because they were denying the Vedas, that they were fun targets, but the Jainas also did.
Yeah.
And so far the Jainas aren't getting the target. What could also be happening is that Ganeri and Adamson are focusing on the Buddhists because the Buddhists have these days quite a lot of clout in the Western world, more maybe than the Jainas.
Much more, yeah.
So maybe for the sake of the audience would find the debate specifically with the Buddhists more interesting than, say, the debates between the Vaisheshikas and the Advaita Vedantas. I don't know, guessing.
To be fair,
Also,
the Jainas tend to be much less threatening and to cause much less harm.
I think that's a fair point to make. Yeah, I wanted also to inquire about the early Buddhism of what you know, Nerdalliun, because you mentioned that early Buddhists were mostly present in Sri Lanka and not in mainland India. While I'm not so sure because I didn't study it a lot, but there were many stupas, Buddhist stupas constructed all over the place in India, at least in the time of Ashoka and before Ashoka. He even visited these places, and they were quite holy places according to them. Many people would do pilgrimages to the place where the tree of where Siddhartha achieved enlightenment was, or was at their time, where he gave his first lecture. All these places were really important for them in the time of the Mauryan Empire, and so I'm not so sure if there was such a clear-cut presence only in Sri Lanka at some point in history. But I would really like to know more about that, if you know.
Yeah, so my knowledge is a bit vague. But so I was thinking the time of not the Vaisheshika text written, not the sutra, the commentary. There wasn't exactly a commentary this time. It was it wasn't a bhashya. It was a more self-sustained commentary. I forgot who the author was of that. But I have in mind that commentary was written with some uncertainty roughly around 300 AD. and I think, yeah, but at the time of Ashoka, there was a reasonable presence of Buddhism on the mainland, and like his conversion, Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism, probably significantly upped the number of Buddhists on the mainland, but that would have been around 300 BCE, so about 600 years earlier. And then after the collapse of the Ashokan Empire, if I'm not mistaken about the history, there was a decline of the popularity of Buddhism in India, India itself, and so by the time it went to China, I think one of the reasons Buddhists migrated to China was just because they like weren't welcome, and they were like looking for greener pastures where communities would sustain them, or they're having a tough time finding people who would give alms. So finding lay Buddhists who would support them. So move away, and that would have, I think, the earliest texts went, or the earliest teachers went over to China around 400 AD, maybe 500 AD, around there. So I'm thinking like by the time, more or less of, was it the Bhashya writer? No, actually, Prasadabhada. Oh, that would have been 6th century BCE. Yeah, so definitely by the 6th century BCE, there would have been after a sharp decline of the popularity of Buddhism in mainland India. But so I wouldn't say so much as like a disappearance of Buddhism in mainland India, but just Buddhism had its heyday in India around the time of Ashoka and right after. And the reason I brought up Sri Lanka specifically is because the earliest texts were written down in Sri Lanka around the year 0, so 50 BCE, between 50 BCE and maybe 50 CE. I think the date I've seen last was 35 BCE, something like that, so just before the time of Christ.
Yeah, this was the very, very summarized slide that I got from this Buddhist book author, whom I attend the presentation of the book. So very, very roughly he gave this flow of migration. But the details, of course, escape me completely, because clearly there was a decline in popularity in India. Yeah, probably coinciding with the phasing out of the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire, which was, according to, I think it was Philip Mass or Cluny, in one of these interviews, they mentioned that the Gupta Empire was favoring much more the Vedic schools, and Buddhism was kind of left to dry, basically.
Yeah, I'm going to pull off of my memory here, and I had it that Buddhism in India had declined before the time of Ashoka. So it was sort of like it had flowered in, about the 6th century BC, and then had kind of spread a little bit to China, and Ashoka almost reintroduced it to a large extent to a lot of the Indian continent. And yeah, no, I don't have much to say about it. I know Sri Lanka was a stronghold for Buddhism, but I don't know how much of that has to do with so much with the conflict with the Hindus, or also because they were, kind of had to flee from the incoming Muslim invasion later as well.
Yeah.
So it's like I don't know enough about Indian history to know exactly just how the stronghold in Sri Lanka got started. I'd look at also, again, up in the more the Bangladesh, Myanmar, that area as well for early Buddhism as well. I'm going to tag on that.
Yeah. So I just would like to point out that I was also just going from rough memory, and so like I'm not entirely sure about the factuality of my recollections. Some of the things that I can remember, like I can remember the earliest surviving, or like the Theravada texts being written down for the first time around 35 BCE. I remember dates for Ashoka, like the number that came to mind were around 280 BCE for something that happened related to Ashoka's life. I don't know if it was his birth or his death or whatever, so we just kind of rounded up to about 300 BCE.
Yeah.
And then, to China, I had 400 to 500, but 600 is close enough, I guess, CE. So, so just that kind of rough thing. I forgot about the Gupta Empire. The other reason I sort of remembered that Buddhism declined in mainland is because a lot of the other schools incorporated elements of Buddhism. So with the
Upanishads,
with the Upanishads and schools focusing on the Upanishads like Vedanta, the posterior Mimamsa schools, they had a lot of the things that the Buddhists were offering that before there weren't schools offering that stuff. And also yoga has been very popular in mainland India for a long time. So between Vedanta and yoga, I think there wouldn't have been much to give the Buddhists an edge. At least the Jainas they're super serious about non-violence to make them a little bit unique. And the Buddhist claim to fame was, "You don't exist." No. Hey, audience, we want your money. Why? Because you don't exist, and neither do we. And we're
it's like the concept of famous last words of an individual life. It's a bit like famous last words of a tradition in a place, because then people would just not take them seriously, or they wouldn't feel compelled to join them, since they are kind of shooting themselves on the foot, to use a Portuguese expression, or putting a stick in the rail, in the wheel of their bicycle, their vehicle, their spokes.
You can see how vows of poverty become very useful there. Give your path to liberation is to give us all your money, and then you'll be free.
Yes.
Works out very well for the religion. Tag.
Okay, so let's keep going a bit with this dialectic between the Buddhists and the Vaisheshikas on this complexity kind of thing, and then we'll talk a bit about time, especially space and time, but especially time. Okay, so the Buddhists would criticize the Vaisheshikas by saying, two distinct objects cannot occupy the same region of space at the same time. Matter is impenetrable. If wholes were real over and above their parts, they would violate this rule. For instance, the two halves of the pot clearly are in exactly the same place as the whole pot. Then Vaisheshikas would probably say something like, the rule about impenetrability needs to be qualified. Although material objects can't usually occupy the same space, this needn't be true if one inheres in the other, as in a substrate. Moreover, the whole has to be in the same place as its parts, because whenever the parts move, the whole has to move with them, as in with the classical example of a chariot. Then the Buddhists. So there was this late 6th century Buddhist called Dharmakirti, who would criticize, saying, take the example of Sitra Rupa. So a cloth made of threads of different colors, as I will share here the wording. So a cloth made of threads of different colors. Suppose some of the threads are blue and others not. What color then is the whole cloth? It clearly isn't blue, since some of its parts are not blue, nor is it not blue, since some of its parts are blue. Is not to say it is both. Will we say then it is both blue and not blue a contradiction? Oh, is not to say it is both blue and not blue a contradiction? So the cloth as a whole is
Oh dear.
call back to this word rupa. Rupa is one. Okay, so maybe you didn't hear when I was talking about the word rupa, I think.
Yes.
Okay. I was just remembering everyone that rupa is one of the 24 gunas that we mentioned in the previous session. The very first one, rupa. Okay, so here's another criticism, a recent one on persistence of wholes. So things that persist over time are wholes made up of so-called temporal parts or slices. For instance, a cloth would persist over time by having parts that exist at different times. David Lewis said, if this were so, then whole objects would have contrary properties. Suppose I dye a white cloth red, then one and the same cloth is both white before I dye it, and then red after I dye it. If the cloth is one and the same whole thing over time, then it has contrary properties. So basically, this is a problem of a monistic view that goes through the dimension of time. Of course, then a rule would need to be made with some common sense that things through the dimension of time, even though we assume that they are the same whole that is kind of traversing the dimension of time, its qualities, due to the fact that time varies, its qualities might vary as well throughout the dimension of time, even though the thing is a whole, a single whole throughout time. But probably there will be some properties that are self-contradicting and cannot exist at the same time in these slices of time, and so probably things will work out in this regard. Then the Vaisheshikas would respond to such criticisms from the Buddhists, so by saying the Buddhist argument can be defeated if we just define our terms more carefully. Properties of an object may be either pervasive or non-pervasive. So a property occurs pervasively if it occurs in every part of an object, a bit like Adi Shankara's orange saffron robe. So yeah, here is a screenshot from that 80s movie where Adi Shankar is literally every time wearing only orange and just orange. So orange can occur non-pervasively also, like in certain traditional multicolored Indian fabrics. This is a part of the Indian more traditional garments. So it's all over the place in terms of the use of threads with different colors to make the fabric and then also the clothes. So although these fabrics have color pervasively, every single thread here is colored. Orange appears non-pervasively in this in such a garment, since no one color appears in every part of it. Wholes may or may not share properties with their parts. So we need to be really, really careful here with the employment of the so-called rice in the pan reasoning. So sometimes when we sample a whole, we might be doing something correctly by sampling and inferring from a part the properties of the remainder of the parts of the whole and even of the entire whole. But other times we might be doing a huge mistake because the part might be non-representative of the whole and of the other parts taken together. Then, so the Vaisheshikas have this discourse here. Sometimes parts have properties that wholes lack. For instance, a thread may be entirely blue, yet be part of a cloth that is not entirely blue. Conversely, a whole can have properties that are lacking in its parts. The kind of reasoning that could explain the idea of wholes being more than the sum of the parts. So, for instance, no single or partial assemblage of a chariot could carry Arjuna into battle. It takes a whole chariot. Moreover, all perceivable wholes have the property of visibility, despite being made from invisible atoms. So, always a ready at hand example from atomists like the Vaisheshikas. Here's a fun fact. Although Kanada and Vatsayana apparently just wanted to defend common sense from the Buddhists, by doing so, they wounded up adopting or refining or constructing or elaborating a highly sophisticated bunch of theoretical and speculative ideas. So maybe this unsavory activity of responding and discussing with adversaries actually is something that is philosophically enriching after all. Also, many Buddhist metaphysical notions that we have heard about today in this session seem to go against the grain of our everyday perception and common sense, while the Vaisheshika are proposing a sophisticated metaphysics that, although it's elaborate and highly speculative in points, it seems to conform better to our experience and intuitive beliefs. So props for them for that. And tagging out because we will be shifting to the time subject.
Yeah, not too much to add to that this time. It is kind of interesting how they had to propose some not common sense ideas in order to defend common sense. So yeah, it's
Yeah, I was going to say what the question that occurs to me is, can a part be a whole? And can you use a whole as a part? Because unless they deal with those, I don't think they're dealing with parts and wholes well enough. Peg.
Probably they would only open exception for atoms.
so for atoms, I do think they consider atoms. Would you say they'd say atoms aren't wholes? They're just parts. Are atoms the only things that are just parts and are not a whole?
Well, I don't know exactly what they would respond, what their position would be. But since atoms are not composed of further parts, then according to their definition, that wholes need different parts and they have all this inherence of the parts. It doesn't seem that the atoms inherit nothing. They're just single entities, and so maybe they wouldn't consider atoms wholes. They would just consider them the very, very how should you say it? The acme of being parts, basically, so to speak.
Yeah, so I don't know how they would categorize them either. They've got a couple of options. They could say the atoms are simple wholes, and that every other kind of whole is a composite whole, or they could go ahead and say no, since atoms aren't composites, they aren't wholes, they're parts. Both of those would be fine, I think. don't know exactly how they would go about that.
They also distinguish between substance, quality, action, and particularity. And I think they reserve particularity for the atoms. So maybe they wouldn't consider atoms wholes because of the way that the atoms would fit in their 7 padarthas. So that's, at least that's the feeling I get.
Yeah, I sort of remember Peter Adamson talking about that they had to introduce this notion of particularity in order to deal with the problem that if 2 different atoms are exactly the same in all of their properties, it might be problematic to identify this atom, identify it vis-a-vis another atom. Like, aren't they just the same atom if they have all the same properties? And so they needed this notion that, like, no, there are particular atoms, sort of an individuation principle, and that the fact that this atom is an individual object, separate from other atoms that are exactly like it in every other way, requires the particularity to be real as well. Something along those lines.
Which is, I think, a problem that still haunts particle physics and chemistry today.
Occurs to me as a potential resolution is they could simply say that an atom is a whole that is its own part, and basically collapse it on itself and saying that's your base unit and just building up off of atoms, sort of in the concept of the unmoved mover sort of idea tag.
They also seem to not want to find themselves using language in a way that could bring about these kinds of conflicts of wondering whether atoms are also wholes, or if they are just particulars, or if they are both at the same time. Maybe the Buddhists would pick on that, because they really seemed fond of picking on vulnerabilities of language in metaphysical systems. But I think the Vaisheshikas were concerned of being more down to earth, and they wanted things with a certain dose of pragmatism to actually work. So maybe they wouldn't even care much to wonder whether atoms are, after all, wholes as well.
Yeah, I kind of spaced out a little bit about how they defined wholes. If they would say a whole, if the definition of whole includes it must have parts, then they wouldn't call atoms wholes. I don't think. I don't recall that we've actually saw a definition of wholes.
Yeah. Well, we have kind of a definition here in the beginning. So parts coming together produce wholes, which are indeed more than just the sum of their parts. So basically, that's maybe why in the back of my mind I wasn't tempted to consider atoms wholes, because they have no parts coming together, and that there's no possibility for emergent properties at all.
Yeah, so atom is not any more than the sum of the atom.
Yeah. and it's really, really important to keep in mind that these atoms would be the equivalent of our maybe quarks. As far as we know, they are indivisible, and so we will probably never figure even out if quarks are divisible, because it's not practical in terms of energy to break them apart. So for all intents and purposes, they are indivisible, and unless we make a particle collider the size of the galaxy, we will probably never go further. So that's that.
Yeah, so the smallest parts, I think the Vaisheshika said, are so they're atoms that pair up, and then was it 3 pairs make some larger unit? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that they had a specific term for these molecules, but the name is escaping me.
Yeah, there would be what we would call molecules. So atoms come together to create molecules that be at the level of chemistry. So, but they had this notion that like the smallest molecules are 2 atoms joined, and then there are larger molecules yet that come in 3 of those pairs joined together. Don't know. I can't recall exactly how they got to that.
Yeah, that's extremely, I should say, speculative for someone without any tunneling microscopes and electron microscopes, mass spectrometers, and actually without even the field of spectrometry, etc., to kind of make statements about that. Yeah,
That sounds a lot like hadron behavior, like you're talking about with quarks, 3 of them combining into the stable ones, and also
yeah,
the
exactly.
2 quark configuration as well, tag.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder. There's this guy called Graham Hancock. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He made a Netflix series of Ancient Apocalypse, I think it was called, and he basically says that the notion from history and archaeology that human progress was just a straight line forward, it's wrong. We are kind of very, very post-apocalyptic, and before this so-called apocalypse, which might have been big floods or whatnot that are reported by many different traditions, Chinese, Sumerians, Hebraic, Abrahamic, and even Native American as well. Before that, there might have existed a global civilization that was way more advanced than we pretend to know and whatnot. And so maybe some of these very, very advanced notions that were found in very, very ancient texts and traditions like the Vedas, which reminds you, the Vedas were written at a time when in Europe, people were kind of just figuring out that they could domesticate dogs to hunt better. And they were hunting mammoths and stuff like that. When in India the Vedas were already a thing, at least orally, and so it's crazy how lopsided civilizational progress might be in a region of the world, while another region is extremely underdeveloped, civilizationally, culturally, architecturally, etc. And then things can reverse. Europe now is more or less well advanced, and other regions of the world are not so much. And at the same time, there are rises and falls of civilizations. The Harappan civilization in Mohenjo-daro of the Indus Valley, supposedly they had the precursor of Ayurveda medicine, and they were using plumbing in their cities. This plumbing technology was lost, just as it was lost during the fall of the Roman Empire. And so it makes one wonder if the stuff that we do know that survived in archaeology, which tends to be the more resilient stuff, and so we know about it. The technology that is more fickle and more perishable, it will all have degraded. And so even if we have the best methods and technology employed in archaeology and many resources, even more than we have now, still we will never figure entirely out what these ancient civilizations really were working with. And so yeah, this Graham Hancock guy is he's not very I think that archaeologists are not very fans of his. big fans of his, because he's always criticizing them, he's always bad mouthing them, and also there's kind of like an accepted worldview of how things were. So arrow of time equates arrow of progress kind of thing, and not just ups and downs and losses of technology and whatnot. And maybe the idea that we've been losing stuff isn't so far out after all. But I would still remain skeptical whether or not Atlantis and the continent of Mu actually existed. So there's that.
Yeah, so I think probably archaeologists dislike Hancock for more reasons than just he badmouths them.
Yeah.
I think I'm not an archaeologist, and like my knowledge of that stuff is limited, but the little bit I've tried to find out about it is the further back we go in history, the less evidence there is to work of things. And there's some very nice art exhibitions sort of creating a timeline just of the footprint people have been leaving, going from sort of like the trash people are leaving around, and just the massive amounts of trash we're creating now, compared to what people were creating 1,000 years ago, and then that was a lot compared to what people were creating 10,000 years ago. And basically when it goes all the way to 100,000 years ago, like, we don't see any trash that you might expect to see, any rubble or whatever. Like, the remains we have are extremely sparse. So we do have remains that go back millions of years, but it's like, well, one would have there's the fact that there's no evidence of, say, a super advanced civilization 200,000 years ago makes it seem like extreme, just egregious speculation to say there was. Like, for someone to just say, like, no, definitely there was an advanced civilization 200,000 years ago, and they had better medicine than we had, and they had spacecraft and all that kind of stuff. Like, if they had, like, where are the remains of the space bases? Like, where are the remains of the cities? Like, where is the evidence of the footprint this advanced civilization had on the planet? Or are we supposing they were so advanced that they had no footprint, and they came from a history of civilizations that had no footprint? I mean, if we're going to speculate over, like, things that happened in ways that left no evidence, we might as well say, like, no, there wasn't just one civilization 200,000 years ago. There've been civilizations that have been popping in and out of existence every 5 days. They just leave no evidence. So you could come up with any shit if your explanation includes in your explanation why there's zero evidence of what happened.
I was going to say the counter argument there is that there's not zero evidence. The evidence that exists, it's questionable. You always have, you have Michael Cremo with, his out of place parts, and it's, and the answer to where would that civilization be? Again, you're not speculating necessarily hundreds of thousands of years. You're basically saying, say, 15,000 years, and the majority of that would be where the majority of our civilizations is, within a couple of hundred of feet of sea level. What percentage of of our world would be left if all of a sudden sea level went up 450 feet, 150 meters? Now, most of those cities would be gone. You could say the same thing happened 10,000 years ago. Just I'm playing devil's advocate for you, Tag.
Yeah, so, but I think of all the oceans, the closer we are to the coasts, the better the bottom of the ocean is mapped out. Like much of the ocean bed remains unmapped out, but I think it's highly unlikely that, like, say, the deepest areas that remain unmapped have been sites, like, were above water, like, within tens of thousands of years ago. So I don't know how quickly the ocean beds drop, but like, ocean floor mapping technology is such that basically all around the continents, I would imagine, can be mapped and probably has been mapped. And like if there were cities there, I think people would have found them by now.
Well, we're constantly finding them. I mean, getting it back to India, that was one of the big things that they found only, within the last decade, is the remains of a sunken city of Dwarpa off the coast of India, and it's basically sitting about 150 to 150 feet underwater, and it's a huge, enormous city. And again, arguments can be made. That's the one that I think it was Rama founded. It's just saying you're finding more and more as we've gotten more of the remote submersibles and more of the mapping ones. We are finding more and more stuff under in that down to about 450 feet range that we didn't know existed. Mediterranean, especially, all sorts of sunken stuff in the Mediterranean. Ag.
Yeah, and another example is the Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey, which was found also very, very recently, which is really crazy. It might have housed 20,000 people, and it was found in 23 or something like that, or the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, I was going to say the Longshu caves in China. Those I only found out about a few years ago. Those are fascinating with the construction and everybody, with the same sort of almost marks on the walls across the planet. It looks like almost machinery, machine drilling.
Yeah. Ag. The thing is, I also side with what Nerdalliun said. We can read about Atlantis in Plato's and Solon's ideas. We can read about stuff like the continent of Mu, where Indonesia sits right now. But we must also stay humble and skeptical. And well, if interesting things are found in terms of evidence, so be it. But we shouldn't also go anxious or crazy because things are not being found. We should accept either outcome.
Yeah, and then I also think it's important to be conservative about interpreting the significance of findings. So, like finding near modern-day coasts, sunken cities all over the world because water levels have risen in 10,000 years. Not necessarily all that exciting. Is there any? So for example, the more exciting kind of speculative ideas may be that people 50,000 years ago had more advanced science than we have today. Like you might say, well, like we're finding cities next to coasts now that only now. So maybe there are Atlantis with this more advanced science that we had today. But yeah, like having found a city is not saying you found a city where there's strong evidence that there was like more technology or better technology, better engineering, better science than we had today. Like what was actually found? Was it just another city? Like was it like how does it compare to Uruk, like say the Sumerian city in terms of architecture and sort of the remains, the tools and stuff they found around? How does it compare to some of the ancient Egyptian stuff? How does it compare? Like I wouldn't be terribly surprised if say this around the time of the ancient Mesopotamians, as far as I know, they were like the most advanced civilization on Earth. So to find a couple of coastal cities that push back the kind of technology the Mesopotamians had a couple of thousand years, be like, okay, that's interesting and fine and well and dandy, but to push it down tens, so like several tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years would be extremely surprising. Like,
yeah, that's kind of
seems unlikely.
That's kind of what Graham argues in his Netflix series, that he says that, oh, okay, these civilizations like the Mesopotamians, the Indus Valley Egyptians, we think that of them as the very first civilizations, and he questions whether they are actually the very first ones, or that they were just taught by these guys that came from the post-apocalyptic global civilization, and then gave these peoples which were more tribal than civilized, gave them kind of training or something like that. So yeah, that's more or less the position that Graham Hancock expresses in the Netflix series. And I think the most interesting thing, regardless of whether or not you agree with his ideas, is the sites that he actually shows. The sites that he shows, like Derinkuyu and the site in Indonesia, with really big stones constructions there, and another one in the middle of the Mediterranean. The name of the island escapes me, but it's more closer to Italy. These sites, I had no idea that they existed. So just for the idea, the opportunity to get to know these archaeological sites is, I think it's worthwhile to see the series, and then you can disagree with Hancock all you want.
Yeah. So just specifically about the Mesopotamians and learning from others. Let's say the standard story has them inventing writing for the first time. Writing also being invented in other places independently, and also inventing mathematics for the first time. There's a fairly clean trace of the evolution of the invention of writing, and it took thousands of years. Like the record they had, the evidential record for how writing emerged in Mesopotamia took thousands of years. So if they learned it from aliens, the aliens took their time. Like they took between 6000 BCE and 2000 BC. They took 4000 years to teach these clueless idiots how to write for the first time.
Yeah, but mind you, he doesn't say aliens like the History Channel guy, the very crazy aliens, pyramids, aliens. No, it's a bit more moderate than that guy. He actually says, well, they were post-apocalyptic humans that knew some technology and stuff, and they would go to these Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and train them, basically, give them the tools of civilization. So that's what he was arguing for. But yeah, take it as you will.
Yeah, I don't know. Giorgio has a lot better hair than Graham Hancock.
Yes.
You know, and I agree with you, Rogério.
Your sound stopped, Graham.
Yeah, I think connection's a little iffy.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, we can just do a bit more back and forth and go into this space and time thing. Let's hope that...
Actually, I wanted to ask, it's getting quite late. The time episode is like less than a quarter Vaisheshika specifically, right? It's more like Indian philosophies of time.
Yeah, exactly. But it's very dialogical. 20 slides. So we have gone through 50 slides now, and we only have 20 slides remaining. So if you really prefer, we can do this on the next session. It's okay, no problem. But if you feel that we can do it, I can do any of the plans.
Yeah, so I think I prefer to call it a day, and I don't know how long it's going to take Graham to get back.
Yeah, okay. So fair enough. Fair enough. But yeah, I was also enjoying this archaeological historical conversation, and
went on a fun tangent, I guess.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to say there is also like evidence going back tens of thousands of years of much more basic ways of counting that may have been useful for organizing life in more primitive ways. So like I don't know, the records that I've seen so far kind of paint a reasonable picture of progression from more primitive technologies to more advanced technologies, more primitive, and especially like organizational and bureaucratic technologies to more advanced, with not much evidence of miraculous leaps of technology anywhere. So I used aliens as just one example, but yeah, it would seem extremely unlikely that like these coastal cities perhaps would not have had any influence on cities further inland, like the well-known cities. So the coastal cities of Egypt, so at Cairo, had influences way inland up the riverbanks, and say the Mesopotamians had influences all the way far afield in Pakistan. So there's a tiny little village in Pakistan, 7,000 BCE, where they basically had the same crops and the same animals and similar pottery and styles of decorating the pottery that was found in Mesopotamia. So inland Mesopotamia. So inland Mesopotamia had influences way far away in Pakistan. Like, why wouldn't a couple of coastal cities that were more advanced also have influences inland? So it would be surprising that these coastal cities that are now underwater would have this super advanced stuff way ahead of anything that the Mesopotamians had, and it wouldn't have spread. It would have just stayed right there at the coast and gotten buried by the sea forever. That would be, I mean, I guess it's within the realm of possibilities. But yeah, so some of the examples are with some of the cave paintings seem to have dotted marks that can be interpreted as calendar marks for when certain animals will be around, specific their migration patterns, mostly, and when it's egg-laying animals, when they would be laying eggs, and that goes back around 30,000 years. So like people were capable of a very crude and rudimentary kind of symbolic thought 30,000 years ago. That there is evidence of that, in like all over Europe, really, and there's all over the world around that same time period are examples of bones with tally marks. So people were keeping record, etching them into bones and saving a count of something. Impossible to tell what they were counting. There's evidence of beads and things around 60,000 years ago. So people may have been using beads as a kind of accounting device, as it was used in Mesopotamia like 8,000 years ago. They may have been doing that as early as 60,000 years ago. Yeah, so there's like smatterings of, or like glimmers of technology and methods of recording symbolic thought that goes back maybe at least as far as 60,000 years ago. Just uncontroversial evidence where like just stuff in museums you can go look at. But yeah, that there's no like basic math like the Mesopotamians were doing to calculate taxes and to calculate how large an army they can support with the year's agricultural yields and that kind of thing. Like, so like for now the record stands like the first kinds of quantitative management texts are around 3000 BC, so about 5,000 years old. And hey, maybe one of these coastal cities will push that back. But given that, say, 20,000 years ago, you'd be lucky to find a cave with a couple of dots on it anywhere in the world, it would be really surprising if even 15,000 years ago you could find solid evidence of quantitative management. To think that maybe 30,000 years ago there was this really advanced civilization, even compared to us advanced, it just seems...
Yeah, that's really crazy, and it's unlikely.
I was going to say one of the things I definitely agree with is bureaucracy is entirely a Homo sapiens development. We
Yeah,
definitely that whole organization into armies and that one. And one of my favorite ones, and it started me down my rabbit hole back in 2019, is the whole Denisovan jade bracelet, which they now date to probably about 60,000 years ago. And it shows unmistakable signs of high speed drilling, the like of which drills people didn't have for tens of thousands of years. So it definitely speaks of some sort of advanced technology just to have those sorts of drills. How much more they had beyond that, what else, everything else, don't know. But I find it intriguing that you, again, like you said, it's a museum piece. You know
yeah,
that that exists. And they know from the micro examination that there was no way to make those holes without, super high speed RPM drills that they have no idea how somebody would have had them pegged.
yeah. And another example that comes to mind are the monolithic temples in India, and I think other parts close to India, where someone employs maybe many craftsmen, very good craftsmen, because these temples are meticulously carved out of big stones, really large stones, and the entire temple is just one piece. It's all carved out from the stone, and it's crazy how these people had patience and craft to do this, and not to mention the technology that they might have used, if these drills, which are manual or whatnot, and other things, but their craft still stands the test of time there. And I've never visited these, but if I went to India, I would really want to see these monolithic temples.
Yeah, sounds good. Graham, while you were away, me and Rogério discussed episode 38 is more or less Indian philosophies of time, not so much Vaisheshika on time, although like Vaisheshika features.
Yeah.
And it's getting quite late. It's like 11:30 already for me. I've got stuff to do tomorrow morning. So I think we're going to call that a day in terms of the Vaisheshikas. I think we've covered basically the two episodes dedicated to Vaisheshika, and even like the second episode was about half dedicated to Buddhist critiques of Vaisheshika.
Yes.
No, that sounds good. You're saying that we've run out of time, and time is going to have to wait till next time.
I may be saying that, but maybe time isn't real. So.
There is this tongue twister in Portuguese, and I can tell you it in English, which will further twist my tongue probably. So time asks time how much time has. Time answered to time that time has the time that time has. Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining as always. It's fun to study philosophy with you guys, and sometimes to wander off topic a little bit. It could be fun as well. I don't know how much fun it is for the viewers, but it's fun participating at least. So thank you, and see you guys next time.
Bye. See you guys next time.
See you next time. Always fun.